Well, years ago, I was sitting with a group of folks planning a capital funds campaign to build phase 2 of the church that I planted in Spartanburg a while back. The question we were kind of kicking around the table together was, what prevents people from being more generous? Well, I sat and listened, and people gave their answers, pretty much the same answers that I'd heard throughout my years in ministry. But after about 20 minutes, this woman who had never said anything the whole time, sitting in the corner, just kind of sheepishly raised her hand, and she said this. She said, "The reason I'm not more generous with my finances and my time is because of fear." She said, "I want to be more generous, but I'm afraid of losing my financial security." Well, you know what happened next? Everybody in the room, they kind of turned and looked at her, and I remember they kind of cocked their head to the side, and one by one, everybody started shaking their head in agreement. In all of my years of ministry, I have never known a Christian who didn't want to be more generous. Unfortunately, it's fear that often gets in the way of our generosity. We all want to excel in generosity. I know we do. But I think what we need is examples of generosity that are going to inspire us to push beyond our fears to become the people that God has created us to be. And you know, that is exactly what was happening in our scripture passage this morning. The writer of this passage is a man named Paul. Paul was trying to inspire the apprehensive Corinthian Christians to excel in their generosity by using the example of Christians living in a region known as Macedonia. Well, take a look at the screens above you. I'll tell you a little bit about Macedonia. The Apostle Paul planted a lot of churches in his short life. 3 of those churches, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, were in the region known as Macedonia. So here are a couple of things that you should know about these Macedonian Christians, and especially because Paul kind of compares the Macedonian Christians with the Corinthian Christians. First of all, the Macedonian Christians were considered somewhat odd, even maybe a little fanatical by the cautious, conservative Corinthian Christians. Second of all, the Corinthians, they enjoyed a more comfortable, a much more stable life, while the Macedonians, they lived in a region that was war-torn. It was rife with poverty. And that's why Paul said in verse 2 of the passage we read that the Macedonians had endured a severe ordeal of affliction. Third, the last thing we should know about the Macedonians is that the tiny sect of Christians in Macedonia were particularly being persecuted. Paul refers to their persecution as Christians 9 times in the New Testament. When he speaks about the Christians in Macedonia, he uses a Greek word, thalipsis is the Greek word, which means hardship, like Christian hardship or Christian persecutions. So, when we read in verse 3 that the Macedonians voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means, can you see what Paul is trying to do in this passage? He's using the example of these Macedonians to inspire the Corinthian Christians to excel in their own generosity. Paul's right. I think all of us need, examples of generosity that inspire us to excel in our generosity. So here's what we want to do. Understanding a little bit of this background, what I want to do is I'm going to reread the first 7 verses of this passage in a contemporary paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. All right, now, You're going to see the passage on the screen, so I want you to follow along as I read. And as you're listening or following along, ask yourself, what do you think is most inspiring about these Macedonian Christians? Okay? To you, my Corinthian friends, I want to report on the surprising and generous ways in which God is working in the churches in Macedonia province. Fierce troubles came down on the people of those churches, pushing them to the very limit. But their trial exposed their true colors. They were incredibly happy, though desperately poor. The pressure triggered something totally unexpected: an outpouring of pure and generous gifts. I was there, I saw it for myself. They gave offering of whatever they could, far more than they could afford, pleading for the privilege of helping out in the relief of other poor Christians. So take a minute, think to yourself, what's most impressive about these Macedonian Christians? What's most inspiring about them to you? Well, one characteristic the Macedonians that inspires me towards generosity is that their emotions were not tied to their finances. Remember that the Macedonians, they were extraordinarily poor. They lived in a war-torn country. And in addition to that, they were suffering ongoing persecutions for being a Christian minority. Yet Paul wrote, the severe trial exposed their true colors. They were incredibly happy, yet desperately poor. It's pretty inspiring, isn't it? Now, in addition to the fact that the Macedonians didn't let their emotions dictate their generosity, they also didn't let their circumstances in life dictate their generosity. Paul wrote of them, the pressures of life triggered something totally unexpected, an outpouring of pure and generous gifts. When I read that, I thought, what happens to me when the pressures of life start to squeeze me? And I wasn't sure I liked the answer to that question, but let me ask you, what happens to you when the pressures of life begin to squeeze against you? Jim Ryle, he writes about a pregame talk that he gave to the Colorado Buffaloes football team a number of years ago. He said, I got everybody in the locker room, and then I asked him this question. I said, what do you get when you squeeze a lemon? And I put a lemon out in front of them. Well, everybody, all the players, all the coaches, they seem to say in one voice, you get lemon juice. But what nobody knew was that morning, I had filled the lemon juice with ketchup. So when I squeezed it really tightly, the red liquid oozed out all over my hand. And everybody in the locker room was taken back by it. You're wrong, I said. The actual answer is that you get whatever is inside of it. And then I said, so what's inside of you? What are you going to see when pressures of life put the squeeze on you? The answer is the same as the lemon question. You'll see whatever is inside of you. Now, when the pressures of life squeezed on those Macedonians, what flowed out? Generosity. Paul was right, these Macedonians, they're pretty impressive people. They were happy with or without money. They were generous when squeezed under pressure. Well, and then in verse 3, Paul describes the Macedonians this way. He says, they gave offering of whatever they could and far more than they could afford. And did you catch that? Even though they were very poor, They went above and beyond what was easy and what was comfortable. In other words, they excelled in generosity. That's pretty inspiring, isn't it? I hope that the Bridge Church will always be known as a church that excels in the generosity of our time, of our considerable talents, and of our treasure. I've been doing New Church for a long time, coaching, consulting. I can tell you without reservation that the new churches that are populated by people who have the joy of generosity and want to excel in the giving of themselves back to the Lord, they are by far and away the most dynamic and vibrant new churches in our denomination. I pray that one of the core habits of our church will be that we will excel joyfully in our generosity. Excelling in things. I asked you before, so let me ask you again. Think for a moment about the things that you excel at. Can you identify maybe just one or two things in your life that you excel at? I'm seeing some furrowed brows here. So quietly whisper to the person, if you know that person next to you, what do I excel at? What do we excel at as people? And why do you choose to excel at that particular thing? I mean, there are lots of reasons why we choose to excel at our jobs, or we choose to excel at our golf game, or maybe we choose to excel as parents or as grandparents. There are lots of reasons why we choose to excel at these, but perhaps the number one reason why we excel at certain things in our life is because we want to be known for what we excel at, right? That's exactly what happened to the Macedonians, isn't it? I mean, consider this. As long as Christians read the New Testament, that's 2,000 years and it's going strong. As long as Christians read the New Testament, the Macedonian Christians will be remembered for what? Yeah, for their generosity, exactly. That's the sort of legacy worth aspiring to, isn't it? That's the sort of legacy we all want, don't we? That's the sort of legacy we want in our new church, right? Or stated differently, is there anyone here this morning who prefers to be memorialized at some point as a cheap, self-absorbed miser? Anyone? Anyone? I didn't think so. I didn't think so. Now, you know, when I do funerals, and mercifully, I don't have to do many, but when I do funerals, many times there are two different narratives of the deceased person, okay? So there's this narrative that I faithfully share about the deceased person from the pulpit. But then, in the back of the sanctuary, after the funeral, there's a different narrative that people are saying sometimes about the deceased person. And sometimes what people are saying in the back of the sanctuary after church are not nearly as flattering as what I was saying from the pulpit during the service. So at your funeral, how do you want to be remembered? What words, what phrases do you want people to say about you? Will the narrative include phrases like close-fisted, tightwad, hoarder? I doubt it. I hope not. Or maybe will somebody say of you someday, she was really something else. She always gave what she could, and then she gave more. He was a person of extraordinary generosity. Every time I turn around, he was always giving more of himself. I think we all want to be more generous. We just need inspiring examples to help us move out from our fears in order to excel in our generosity. The Macedonians give us a good example. A few years ago, I was attending a conference at Montreat, North Carolina. I heard the story of contemporary Macedonians, and I'd like to share that with you this morning. The keynote speaker there, she shared this amazing story about generosity that she witnessed while serving a profoundly poor congregation in a blighted area of Austin, Texas. She said to us, "One thing I realized very quickly working with those suffering generational poverty was how much they relied on assistance programs. But one thing I didn't realize, however, was that while there are hundreds of assistance programs out there, there's no assistance offered to help families bury their dead." She said 2 weeks before the conference, she said 2 weeks ago, I had 2 people die in my congregation, one from natural causes and the other, a man named Benny, who died of self-inflicted causes. And then she said, do you know that it takes a minimum of $2,000 to bury a loved one in my poor neighborhood? She said that means that the grief Benny's family had about losing Benny was compounded by the humiliation of not having enough money to bury Benny. But my church knew this, she said. My church knew this. It happens time after time to the poor. So the church did what they typically do in these times. She said they organized a plate lunch. Now, a plate lunch is where the church gets together on a weekend and cooks up a storm. And then on Sunday after church, the believers gather out on the front lawn and they sell the food for $5 a plate. And then she said to us, she said, you know, what stunned me was not that the plate lunches raised the $2,000 needed to bury Benny. What stunned me was how the poorest of the poor people kept buying food, plate after plate after plate, until the funds were raised, even if it meant being late for an electric bill. Friends, that's people who have moved from fear to generosity. And they inspire me. So one final observation about these Macedonians. Paul says of the Macedonians that they were begging for the privilege of helping out in the relief of poor Christians. Begging. Now, I know what you're probably saying. You're probably saying to yourself, begging to be generous, that's not who I am. Well, I beg to differ. So here's a question for you all. Think about the last time you went out for dinner. Maybe 4 of you were around a table. 6 of you were around a table. Okay, you had a wonderful meal, agreeable meal, maybe a nice bottle of wine, perfect ambiance. And then at the end of the meal, it came time to leave, and so the dinner check came. What happened next? Here's my guess. Somebody grabbed that dinner check and said, I've got it tonight. No, it's on me. And then the person across said, no, it's my turn. Let me pay for it. And then you said, no, on me. And then they said, no, I insist. And pretty soon there's a little argument going on. And the sum of the argument is all about what? Begging to be generous. Begging to be generous. You get my point, right? We all have the capacity to be generous, even to beg to be generous. Generosity is in each of us, bound only by our fears. Paul knew this, and so he wrote in verse 7, now, as you excel in everything, so we want you to excel in generosity. Friends, we all have the capacity to be generous, and we all want to be generous. I pray we will make generosity a core habit here at the Bridge, that we will always be known as people who excel in giving of our time and our talent and our treasure to transform lives, to transform this community for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I know we're off to a great start already. Thanks be to God for that.